My talk is on the inspiration of
Well, I think the
Joseph
Sustainable
Stiglitz,
Development Goals are
and
important
here's a little
as
bit from
norm
Joseph
setting,
Stiglitz.
setting standards to which everybody should aspire, to which everybody should adhere. These Sustainable Development Goals in some ways are even more important because they apply not just to developing countries, but to the developed countries. One of the important points of the SDGs is to say, no, there's a much broader agenda out there. GDP is not an end in itself, it's a means to an end. And if GDP goes up, but most people's standard of living goes down, something is wrong. Our economy is not performing. In that sense, I've been saying very explicitly, the American economy is a failure because for a vast majority, there have been no increases in standard of living. The idea that there being so many goals and so many targets has been criticized because it detracts from a sense of focus. I'm not so concerned. The SDGs are meant not just for governments. Very clearly, they're meant for our society as a whole. Each corporation can say, well, here's a list of things that we ought to be thinking about. Some corporations, almost all corporations, ought to be thinking about the environmental goals. They also ought to be thinking, are they treating their workers fairly? There were many other goals that other people wanted to put into the list. The fact that so many people wanted to have what they were worrying about on this list is testimony to the potential influence of these goals because it will play an important role in norm setting in both the developing and the developed world.
So my presentation is on the inspiration of Joseph Stiglitz, intellectual property, sustainable development and inequality. So in particular, I really want to focus upon Sustainable Development Goal number 10, looking at equality, but thinking about how it affects a wide range of other contexts that have been raised in the discussions in relation to intellectual property and sustainable development. So in many ways today, I'm trying to integrate some of my various different interests relating to health matters like access to medicines and tobacco control, some of my environmental interests into IP and climate change, but also some concerns about IP and access to knowledge. Just quickly, I should also add that the QT IP and Innovation Law program is very interested in themes around international trade and sustainable development, IP, privacy, free speech and human rights, innovation law and open access to knowledge. We have about a dozen researchers as part of our group, and Dr. Kylie Pappalardo, the chair today, is in charge of our intellectual property research theme. We have a couple of new arrivals, Associate Professor Mark Burden from UQ and Professor Kieran Tranton for Griffith, and I think it's also an appropriate junction to bid farewell to Deshana, who's just about to submit his PhD. Don't go, we love you so, is a phrase from Where the Wild Things Are, and I think that is an appropriate remark to say in relation to your time here at QUT. So my presentation today is really thinking about the contribution made by Joseph Stiglitz to some of the debates about intellectual property and sustainable development and inequality. Stiglitz rose to fame in 2001, winning the Nobel Prize for Economics, really in relation to asymmetrical information and how that worked in different markets. More recently, he won the Sydney Peace Prize. So in November, he's going to give his talk on the Sydney Peace Prize, and he won that prize for leading a global conversation about the crisis caused by economic inequality, for exposing the violence inflicted by market fundamentalism, and for championing just solutions to the defining challenge of our time. How can we break the cycle of power and greed to enable all peoples and the planet to flourish? So Stiglitz himself says it was a great honour to receive this recognition. It comes at a time not only when there is a growing recognition of the magnitude of the crisis in capitalism and democracy caused by the Great Divide in our societies, but the political and economic consequences are being felt worldwide. We cannot have durable peace without social and economic justice, and our political and economic system today are failing to create a world with such justice. and he suggests somewhat more hopefully that another world is possible, one marked by greater equality, more democratic participation, and stronger, more sustainable growth. As we've just heard from the little video that we had before, Stiglitz has been a great champion of the Sustainable Development Goals, notably in the Great Divide. He's busy lobbying for separate recognition of equality and inequality as a Pacific goal to focus upon, which he was finally kind of victorious in. Partly he saw that as a corrective to some of the weaknesses and limitations of the Millennium Development Goals. So he wanted to introduce a larger conversation about equity and equality into the discussions. His work on equality has been a great obsession of late. So in the last few years, he's published a few books focusing upon the price of inequality, the Great Divide, rewriting the rules of the American economy. He's been very kind of concerned about inequality being a choice, and he kind of argues that inequality is not inevitable. He's been particularly worried about the problem of rent-seeking, and rent-seeking leading to the rise in inequality. He's been concerned about the situation in the United States, where there's a great level of inequality across a number of different dimensions, but he's also been concerned about the globalisation of inequality. So his books like The Price of Inequality and The Great Divide and Rewriting the Rules of the American Economy are very much concerned about questions about inequality, but he also focuses in on the legal system and inequality in relation to the legal system. He's very kind of concerned about inequality within the legal system and the way that big corporations and repeat players have certain strategic advantages within that system. But he's been particularly concerned about inequality as it is manifested in relation to intellectual property law, policy and practice. So he's been concerned about the rise of patent trolls in relation to information technology. He's been concerned about drug companies charging exorbitant prices in relation to pharmaceutical drugs. He's been concerned about companies like Myriad Genetics trying to seek patents in relation to genetic testing. And he's had an increasing interest in also questions about intellectual property and agriculture, intellectual property and climate change. He's very concerned about the embedding of high intellectual property standards into trade and investment agreements. So in my talk today, I'd really like to explore his articulation of some of those themes to help provide a framework for some of the later conversations today. But really, he argues for the need to restore balance to intellectual property rights. So in his view, the intellectual property regime has become quite distorted, and he recommends that there needs to be reforms to the intellectual property regime, but he also calls for, additionally, alternative models to support innovation. For instance, open access models that Jenny was talking about, putting things in the public domain, the use of prizes, the use of other forms of incentives other than intellectual property rights. This kind of thesis has been stated quite broadly, but recently in the last year, in 2017, a document called Innovation, Intellectual Property and Development, a better set of approaches for the 21st century, there's a 70-page effort to systematically think about intellectual property and sustainable development, and a number of different contexts in which some of those issues play out. So in my talk today, I'd just like to roam over some of the contexts in which Stiglitz has been kind of particularly concerned about some of these issues. In some respects, I'm going to be reinforcing what our earlier speakers have said already today, but also I'd like to really foreshadow some of the themes and issues that some of our later speakers are going to grapple with. So much like Sarah Bannerman and Jenny Barber, Joseph Stiglitz has been very concerned about the impact of intellectual property upon education and access to knowledge. And this is particularly evident in the recent book that he did with Bruce Greenwald, Creating a Learning Society. And he kind of lamented that the direct effect of intellectual property rights is to impede the flow of knowledge and therefore impede the learning process. We have seen that there is an indirect effect encouraging secrecy, which can be adverse when intellectual property rights is extended to traditionally open institutions like universities. Offsetting these costs allegedly are the strong incentives for innovation for the acquisition of information. So he highlights some of the dangers of strong intellectual property rights for follow-on innovation, for enclosing the knowledge commons, for encouraging a culture of secrecy. He's been very concerned about litigation risks, the rise of IP thickets and patent trolls. He's very concerned about discrepancies between private returns and social returns and distorted incentives, looking at things like enhancing market power, mispricing, the knowledge pool. He argues for the reform of the IP system in terms of dealing with subject matter, the breadth of IP rights, curtailing abuses of market power through limitations on IP rights, the use of compulsory licenses. But ultimately he wants to design an intellectual property regime to promote learning, to recover some of the early enlightenment goals of intellectual property, to progress science and the useful arts, to create IP regimes that were statutes of learning. But additionally, he's very keen on government-funded research, open source models, prizes and other market-based mechanisms. Increasingly in his recent work with Dean Baker and Andrew Jaydev, he's been concerned about the application of IP in relation to food, agriculture and access to plant genetic resources as well as biodiversity as well. And I know we have a number of speakers in the next session that are going to pick up some of those issues, and Professor Charles Lawson is also going to look at some of the concerns in relation to intellectual property and biodiversity. But Stiglitz, as an economist, is very concerned about the concentration of intellectual property in relation to agriculture through patents and trademarks and trade secrets and confidential information, but also very specialist regimes like plant breeders' rights and geographical indications that are additional to some of the general regimes of intellectual property. Drawing upon some of the work of Special Rapporteur Olivia de Schutter on the right to food, Stiglitz has been concerned that agricultural intellectual property poses high costs to the economic independence of the rural poor and the diversity and resilience of plant life. And he's been very concerned about some of the differential developmental impacts of such an intellectual property regime. And moreover, he's kind of concerned about how that will affect both research but also traditional models of farming one way or another. Historically, Stiglitz was always very interested in some of the battles in relation to access to medicines and questions about patents versus prizes. So his research was very much influenced by some of the big conflicts in the 1990s when some of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies sued Nelson Mandela's South African government over trying to get access to generic medicines for HIV medicines. That was then resolved by the companies withdrawing that action, and certain international mechanisms like the Doha Declaration and the WTO General Council came into place. Stiglitz, though, has been very kind of concerned that there still remains distortions within that system. So in his article, Scrooge and Intellectual Property Rights, he argues that developing countries paid a high price for the TRIPS agreement, and he's very kind of concerned that poor people cannot afford drugs, and drug companies make investments that yield the highest returns. And he's been very much of the view that a medical prize fund would provide an alternative system of supporting research and development. And certainly some of his ideas fed into the UN High-Level Panel on Access to Medicines. So Justice Kirby was here the other year and talking about the new UN High-Level Panel report on access to medicines that promotes the use of TRIPS flexibilities. It suggests that countries make use of alternative models of research and development like prizes. It promotes open access and open data and open innovation, but it also has an important emphasis upon building strong and robust health institutions. And Stiglitz has been a champion and a promoter of that panel report, as many of the brand name pharmaceutical companies have opposed it, and the Obama and the Trump administration have tried to squish and quash that report and ensure that it had no particular influence. Stiglitz has also been very interested in gene patents and the issues that they raise in relation to equality and inequality, in relation to healthcare, in relation to gender rights, in relation to kind of some of the concerns about economic welfare. He was kind of delighted by the Supreme Court of the United States decision against myriad genetics, finding that mere genes were products of nature and therefore not subject to patent protection. In Australia, we had the High Court of Australia decision which took the view that mere genes were intellectual information and not proper subject matter for patent law. But Stiglitz used those case studies to mount a larger kind of discussion and argument about how intellectual property reinforces inequality. And he said that superior courts should definitely follow the model taken by some of the superior courts, like the Supreme Court of the United States and the High Court of Australia, in relation to gene patents. In his most recent work, he's also been working hard on intellectual property and climate change, and he's become increasingly kind of concerned about whether intellectual property rights may create barriers to access to clean technologies. He notes there's mixed evidence thus far, but he's kind of concerned about the question about how do you properly diffuse clean technologies like solar power or wind power, new developments like energy batteries, energy efficiency, green vehicles. He's interested in some of the problems in relation to access to those key technologies. He's defended the Paris Agreement, often in terms of being a very kind of important agreement to ensure action is taken in respect of climate change, but he has also drawn a very strong link between the Paris Agreement and some of the discussions in relation to sustainable development. He's also given expert evidence in the action by kids against the Trump administration in a major piece of climate litigation, resting both on constitutional law but also upon certain older notions in relation to public trust as an expert witness in relation to economics. I just want to kind of wrap up by mentioning some larger issues about investment and trade that the next two speakers will touch upon. Stiglitz has been very concerned about linkages between intellectual property and investment. He's concerned that investor-state dispute settlement may give intellectual property holders additional superpowers to take action against government or governments in respect of regulatory action that adversely affects their investments. So he's very interested in the controversy over plain packaging of tobacco products. Australia has successfully defended its pioneering public health measure in the High Court of Australia, in an investment tribunal and in the World Trade Organisation. But Stiglitz has been very concerned about the use and abuse of investment agreements. He's also been very concerned about globalization and inequality and the use of trade agreements, particularly to entrench certain intellectual property standards. So very concerned about the TRIPS agreement, as I mentioned before, but he has also been a very ardent critic of the Trans-Pacific Partnership in terms of the intellectual property chapter, the inclusion of investor-state dispute settlement, and some of the impacts of that agreement upon public health and environmental standards and labour rights. He's been very concerned about the climate denial in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He's recently done a revised version of that work called Globalization and Its Discontents, trying to take into account the Trump administration. He says there are three ways forward in terms of the current debates over trade and globalisation. One is to double down on the Washington Consensus, which is very much the Obama approach, promulgate free trade agreements which also have very high standards in relation to intellectual property and investment. Then there's the Trump approach of the America First policy with its model of new protectionism, which he also thinks is quite distorted. But he argues that we should champion fair globalisation with some shared protectionism. And just to conclude, in terms of his overarching vision, much like Professor Sarah Bannerman, Stiglitz is of the view that we need a substantial recalibration of the international approach to intellectual property rights to ensure the advancement of the standards of living and well-being of the entire world, and to ensure consistency with development objectives and obligations, and to support those innovations that they have the highest value in terms of their contribution to addressing the challenges facing our global society. And he thinks that such reforms are particularly urgent given some of the large global issues related to public health, climate change, and also food security. Thank you.